Good morning, everyone. Welcome to meeting number 5 of the Committee on Rulemaking to consider the recommendation on public engagement and agency rulemaking under the good cause exemption. Thank you all for being here today. Again, we'll just do the normal beginning protocols. I'm going to call the roll first of committee members and their alternates, and then folks who are not members of the committee and their alternates. I'm not going to call on members of the public who don't have speaking privileges. Starting with members of the committee. Laura Barheit.
I'm here, and I'm actually going to be here for the whole meeting.
Say that one more time, Laura. Sorry.
I'm going to be here for the whole meeting. I had told
great.
you that somebody else was going to be the alternate to second hour.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Amy Bunk.
Here.
Stephanie Davis.
Here.
Andrew Emery. Andrew, I think he may be joining, but we'll see. I see Bill Funk.
Here.
Alex Goodenough.
Here.
Is Michael Hertz here?
I'm here for a bit anyways.
Okay, great. All right, I think Courtney Mallon is going to join for Phil Huey later, but Courtney, are you here right now? Okay. Mitch Plave.
Here.
Right. I see Lon Smith.
Here.
Miriam Vincent. Hopefully Miriam can join at some point. I'm assuming there might be one or two folks on the committee whose names I haven't called, so feel free to speak up now if I didn't call your name and you're on the committee.
Seth Davis.
Daniel
Seth.
Weiss.
Thanks, Seth.
And Daniel Weiss.
All right, Daniel, thanks. Anybody else?
Jessica Stone.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Anybody else on the committee whose name I didn't call? All right. Now we'll go to non-committee members. Is Jeff Lubbers here?
Yes, I am.
All right, great, Jeff. Matt Weiner. I see Ron Levin.
Here.
Thank you. I think I saw Annalise Marcia So.
Good morning.
And Cohen. Thank you. I believe we have Erica Lunder for Mohammed Masbahi.
Yep, I'm here. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And that's all I had. I'm probably missing some folks that are members, but not on the committee. Anyone whose name I didn't call? Oh, no, I got everybody. Okay. All right, Bertrand, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So I'll start as usual with the script and then we'll get started. So please note that only ACUS members, including government members, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsel, whether or not on the committee and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. To avoid background noise, though, I'd ask that you keep your microphone on mute and either use Zoom's hand raise feature or add a comment in the chat feature if you'd like to speak. I'll then call on you and you can unmute yourself. Please then remute yourself when you're done. I also ask that ACUS members and their designated alternates use the webcams to facilitate conversation. With respect to attendees other than ACUS members and alternates, participation requires unanimous consent of the committee members. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on such attendees at appropriate points, and we'll presume that committee members consent absent their raising an objection. If any such participant would like to speak, please so indicate in the chat feature or by using Zoom's hand raise feature and wait to speak until I call on you. You can then unmute yourself and please remute yourself when you're done speaking. For all participants, please use the chat feature only to indicate that you'd like to speak, or for committee members and their alternates to vote when asked. Please do not hold any sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. Only members of the Committee on Rulemaking, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels have a vote. Please do not vote unless you're a member of the committee. We have a list of committee members in case you're unsure. Okay, so the plan for today is to begin where we left off after last session, which is with the recommendations on IFRs, interim final rulemaking, and then we will proceed from there to supplemental public forms of public engagement section, and then back to the preamble. We still have a leftover issue with respect to the direct final rulemaking with respect to 4D that we will return to at the end of the meeting. Let's just get started with interim final rulemaking. And again, I'll ask, as I asked in the last meeting, that we try to keep comments that are focused on, broad suggestions, rather than wordsmithing, and then we'll let the ACUS staff take a crack at wordsmithing it as appropriate. So let's just get started with recommendation number 7. Michael.
Well, hearing nothing, I'll just repeat the comment that I submitted, which is now in the margin there. This is the same issue we discussed with DFR about whether we really want to say any time that the impracticable or contrary to the public interest exceptions are invoked, the agency should conduct an IFR, or whether there might be some situations where it wouldn't. Seems to me actually clearer with IFR than DFR that there will be situations where they would invoke these exceptions and not do an interim final rulemaking. The most obvious one would be the emergency short-term rule, where it really is pointless to do any kind of ex post process. And so given that, I suggest we have some additional language noting that, because it's the other parts of the good cause exception, the other prongs, the exact language we had for DFR, I don't think quite fits. Thanks, Ben, for putting it there. And so my suggestion would actually be to add at the end. So an agency should use interim final rulemaking when it's impracticable or when it's contrary to the public interest, unless doing so, i.e. using interim final rulemaking, would itself be impracticable or contrary to the public interest.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that, Michael. Did you capture all that, Ben? Okay. I'll let Ben sort of put this on paper before calling on you, Bill. So doing so would be impracticable or contrary to the public interest. Is that right, Michael?
Yeah, that's right. And then obviously remove the period in 7 at the end of 7B.
Right, right.
You need the word itself in there.
I guess, sure.
Okay. Bill.
I support this change, although I think it goes better at the beginning rather than the end. I think start off the sentence just like we did with direct final rulemaking.
I totally fine with that personally. Couldn't care less.
Okay. So we can move that as the beginning of 7. Okay. Any objections to this change? Annalise.
Yeah, I'm not sure that, so I'm thinking of the example that I've used repeatedly in these discussions, which is the Department of Transportation's flight restrictions, which, it's not necessarily impractical or contrary to the public interest. In the contrary to the public interest, I would say, in the way that the case law uses that term for FA to not do an IFR, to do a final rule with without notice and comment. They could, finalize it at a later date. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but they could do it. And so I would recommend rather just saying an agency should consider using interim final rulemaking, and agencies could then have the option to determine the circumstances under which it's not appropriate for them.
Okay, and so that proposal would take out that language at the beginning of 7 that we just added, and just add should consider instead. Is that the proposal? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Annalise. Ron.
Whereas 95-4 just said do it, with a qualifier for temporary rules. I think we don't really have a good record as to circumstances that would fall within the situations Michael envisions. I don't want to be absolutist about it, but maybe there's a middle ground between specifying a criterion, which we haven't spent a lot of time debating, and on the other hand, just saying consider it. I think we could say agencies are encouraged to use interim final rulemaking when A and B are satisfied.
Okay. So we have 3 ideas on the table. We have the original language or the language at the beginning of 7. Consider using and encourage. Michael.
I take Annalise's point. If I understand it correctly, I think what you're saying, Annalise, is it may not be impracticable or contrary to the public interest, but it's unnecessary, right? That in other words, that it falls under the 3rd prong in those. So one possibility would be adding unnecessary here, but I'm totally happy with Ron's suggestion as well. You know, just tracking the APA is a way of ducking the issue that we don't have the record Ron points out we don't have, and are encouraged to, is another way of doing that, and I think that's fine.
Okay, so proposal, unless doing so would itself be impracticable, contrary to public interest, or unnecessary, agencies should use interim final rulemaking when it, or agencies should consider using interim final rulemaking when it, or agencies are encouraged. So those are sort of 3 ideas on the table. Annalise, with the addition of the term unnecessary to that beginning of 7, address your concerns, or do you still stick by consider using as a proposal?
I would prefer, you know, it sounds like the preference is probably more for Ron's language, and I would prefer that to adding unnecessary, just because as Ron pointed out, we haven't fully discussed all of the ramifications, and it would be challenging to discuss all of the ramifications, right? So I'd rather just keep it open. So.
Okay. Okay.
I'll withdraw my suggestion.
Okay, so we're going to take out the preambulatory language or the initial language. So an agency is encouraged to use interim final rulemaking when it, or agencies are encouraged, excuse me. Is that the language that we are working with?
Yes.
Okay. So any
Well, no.
objection?
The latter part says it. So I guess we're talking about in individual case is what we mean. So
Right. So
it would be singular.
Yeah, an agency is encouraged to use interim final rulemaking when it. Okay. Any objections to this language? This revision, excuse me. Any other suggested changes with respect to recommendation 7? Okay. So let's move to recommendation number 8.
And just a note for members, some of these edits are, if you see edits in track changes, they're edits that were part of the comments that were submitted in advance of the meeting. And I can identify, or the members can identify if they were responsible for these edits, but if they were kind of more approaching stylistic, I just kind of left them as, but didn't drop a comment.
Right, thanks, Ben. Is there a way to get all of 8 on the screen? If not, we'll just kind of go piece by piece. Okay, thanks. So any comments on 8A? Okay, 8B. C. Yes, Annalise.
I just, my question is what, is C necessary? And is it necessary for these recommendations? Because it's, standard rulemaking practice and it's required by other, there are other legal requirements to do that, so I just question that.
Right. So it seems redundant here because it's required otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay. Bill.
Well, I don't think it is required by other law because it qualifies as a for cause exception. So because it qualifies for cause exception, none of these would be applicable under law.
Annalise, response, if you have any.
A good cause exception, my understanding is that it doesn't absolve an agency from needing to describe the basis and purpose of the rule.
So the proposal I take from Annalise would be to delete C. And see if there's any objections to that proposal as it stands. Ron.
Isn't it standard practice to do that? I agree with Bill, but the APA doesn't say that. But it may, the interim final rule may also be challenged on arbitrary capricious grounds, and you want the agency to spell out the reasons why it took this action in order to allow for meaningful judicial review of it. I believe that it's standard practice to do it, even though I agree that the APA can be read not to require that.
Bill, is that an old hand or a new hand?
You're muted.
Old hand.
Okay. Miriam.
So there is also a requirement in the ACFR regulations in 1 CFR, I think it's 18.12, that applies to documents that are published in the Federal Register that requires supplementary information that describes what the rule is and what you're doing. Now, the Office of the Federal Register itself cannot make a determination as to whether an agency has adequately described what they're doing in supplementary information. We only require that you have one. But the requirement is there in the regulations, which applies to all documents, not just documents that are issued under the APA.
So Miriam, do you think that this provision adds something in terms of specificity that's important to keep, or do you agree with Annalise that it's unnecessary here?
Right. So, I mean, I agree with Annalisa that this is, even if it's not covered by the APA, it's covered by the Federal Register publication regulations.
Okay.
But I mean, the caveat is that OFR does not enforce the content. We just ensure that there is content there.
Right.
And then it's up to the agency to determine what that content should be.
Okay. Thanks, Miriam. Mark.
Just quickly, I think at worst this is redundant, but at best it may sort of clarify for the agency what its obligation is, and I don't see the downside in leaving this in.
Annalise, do you have a sense, other than redundancy, is there a downside that we should be mindful of in terms of with leaving this in?
No, just redundancy. I guess the other question I would have is this included for other for recommendations for other rules published without notice and comment for DFRs and like that section?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we have this in the DFR section? I don't. I probably should have memorized DFR by now.
Oh yeah, it is there.
Yeah, it's C. So it's parallel with C. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So we'll leave it in unless there are objections to leaving it, other objections to leaving it in. Okay, we'll move on to 8D. Okay, 8E. 8F.
Old numbers are new.
Oh, new F. Sorry, thank you. New F. That starts as applicable.
Yeah, I just want to know, I believe this came from Alex Goodenough, and I did modify the language stylistically to some extent, so just wanted to note that.
Thanks, Ben. New 8G. And new 8H. Ron, sorry. Oh, did you have your hand up? It went up and down.
I do.
Okay, Ron, yes.
I think that this paragraph as read misses a fundamental point, which is that the whole model of interim final rulemaking is that the agency says it will follow up with a with a later reaction to the comments. Under what circumstances doesn't adhere to that. Now, we're only encouraging to use the model, but the model contemplates that they pledge to do it. We'll get to the fact that they don't necessarily do it, but nevertheless, that's true in a lot of situations. The model says we're inviting comments, which we might do something with. I don't think that's right. They invite comments and they say that they will respond to it. So also the when I think might be quite speculative and not very feasible. So I would reword it to say specifies that the agency will publish a subsequent final rule that may alter the interim final rule. See paragraph 9.
Okay. That's will take a while. When and under what circumstances? Or let's keep the agency. Specifies that the agency will publish a subsequent final rule that, and you had different language instead of supersede.
That may alter
the interim rule.
I mean, supersedes, I guess, is right, but it's not communicating as much.
Okay.
I mean, it would probably be okay, but
okay.
I'm throwing mine out as an alternative.
Got it.
Yeah, ACUS staff thought about this kind of question a little bit here. I mean, I get the possibilities for following up on an interim final rule that the agency could, modify, eliminate, or just adopt the interim final rule as it was originally adopted. So supersedes is kind of a general term that might refer to any of those eventualities.
Yeah, I don't object to that. I just leave it.
Okay, so keep supersede.
Keep supersede.
Okay. Jeff.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a pitch for replacing subsequent final rule with final rule. Interim final rule, the term is kind of a made-up term that's not in the APA, and if we're just, the term subsequent final rule seems a little too vague. It's like something that might happen, a few years from now, or we'll do another rulemaking or something like that. So I think it would be useful for ACUS to sort of develop the term final rule in the context of IFR.
Okay. So the proposal of final rule. So we have two proposals on the table, both with Ron. Let me see if there are any objections to specifies that before turning to Amy. And then getting rid of when and under what circumstances. Any objections to that particular change? Okay, so we'll go with that, and we'll still wrestling with the final rule point. Amy.
A couple things. I'm not sure supersedes is actually, I have a little bit of a problem with that, because if the agency simply confirms the final rule, I'm not sure people will understand that confirmation is a supersedure. The final rule, I also have I'm a little squeamish about that as well, because I'm wondering if people will understand that to mean that a final rule or an interim final rule isn't really a final rule. And there'll be some assumptions about what is a final rule. So just throwing that out there.
Right. Okay. So we'll continue to wordsmith and play with that word supersedes and see if we could come up with a better term or phrase. But we're still on the final rule. So Mark.
Yeah, just to sort of support Amy's point, I think it's clear if you're saying you're going to publish a final rule that that's distinct from an interim final rule. I don't think you need to say anything more than just a final rule.
Okay. Jeff, since this is your proposal, I'll let you respond to that comment.
Well, I've gotten some support from a couple of other people. I see Michael Hertz and somebody else just sent a message. But in the context of IFR, I mean, I think it's if we're going to carve out a special process for this term interim final rule, then why not make clear that the next step would be a final rule? It just seems logical to me. We could put it in quotes if that would help, but or even hyphenated. I don't know, but it just seems like it's a useful term in this context, and it's apparently being used.
Right. Bill.
I have always thought the term final rule was sort of an inside the beltway type of expression. I wouldn't have it if we in the preamble sort of explained this term final rule. I'd have less objection to it in the recommendation. That's one point. The other point is I want to back up what I understood Amy saying, which is it's my feeling that in interim final rule, you take comments, and if the comments lead you to want to change in some way, that you didn't issue another rule, call it a final rule or subsequent final rule or whatever. But in many cases, if not most cases, you won't change it. You'll respond to the comments and explain why you're not changing it, and you won't issue another rule. You'll just leave the interim final rule there because you respond to the comments, and the effective date doesn't change. The effective date was originally when you issued the interim final rule, and it will just continue on. If you issue another final rule, then you have a new effective date issue, all right? And that seems to raise some problems. So if you're going to change the rule in some way, then you should have a different effective date probably. But I like the opportunity for saying that you will publish a response to comment and issue a new final rule if appropriate.
Yeah.
So the effective date issue is interesting though then, because if you don't do anything and you just let the interim final rule, become the rule, or, you confirm it without announcing you're confirming it, then the
But you
agency,
announce it. You announce that you're confirming. You respond to the comments and say we're not going to change it.
but then the 30-day effective date goes from the original publication.
Well, the original publication didn't have a delayed effective date because it was an emergency or not practical for the impractical.
So what's the effective date consequence of it then?
If you don't issue another rule, you haven't changed the rule. The rule is there. It is now in effect the final rule, but you haven't issued a new rule. If you issue a new rule, then you have to raise the question of what's the effective date of this new rule.
And so I'm just trying to capture, Bill, what your comments mean for the recommendation 8H. Is it?
Well, I would say specifies that the agency will publish a response to the comments and I'd say new final rule if appropriate.
Okay.
If it changes, then it would have to have a new effective date, wouldn't it?
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. If you changed it, but if you didn't change it, but still issued a new rule that was the same language, you'd have an effective date issue. Maybe you'd say good cause, but I don't know. It's just an additional burden. I mean, I think you'd have to go through OMB again. I don't think you'd have to go back to OMB again if you didn't change it. I think it's an additional hurdle for the agency to actually have to formally issue a new rule if it's not changing.
That puts a lot of incentive on the agency to not change its interim final rule then.
I think if the comments don't justify changing it, then I think they shouldn't have to change it. And they shouldn't have to go through the hassle of issuing the rule all over again.
Okay, we'll move forward to Ron.
Yeah, if you scroll down a little bit, 2 or 3 lines, you see on 150 to 151, responding to comments and modifying or rescinding. I think it should be changed to reaffirming, modifying, or rescinding. And if you're going to do that, which is only a few lines later, then maybe you don't need to spell it all out in 146 to 148. The impatient reader will have his curiosity satisfied within 2 lines.
Okay.
And so maybe all you want to say is that they will publish, call it for the moment, a final rule in response to the comments. I personally find that unaesthetic. And in a recent article, I used the term replacement rule, which I offered for your consideration.
Okay.
But something like that probably is a
Right,
useful term.
right. All right. So in light of what's in 9, do you agree with Ron's comment that it's unnecessary to specify the language or to put forth the language that you propose here in 8H, Bill?
Yes, I agree. I agree we could take it out. I don't agree with the requirement to issue it. 9's requirement to issue a rule if you're going to simply reaffirm the rule.
Okay, so we'll turn to that question shortly. Okay, so we'll take out the response to the comment
Well, taking out H altogether.
Taking out H altogether. So is H necessary in light of 9? Is that how far your comment goes, 9, Ron? Or are you just saying we should have a?
I hadn't thought about that. Maybe, but maybe it's helpful to say, we'll consider your comments and then we'll take appropriate action in substance. Maybe something like that should be on the list, but we shouldn't draft it here.
Okay. Miriam.
So as a practical matter, when an agency confirms or adopts the interim rule, if they've made no changes, they do not set out the rule, the text of the rule again, because it's already in the CFR. There is no new effective date. They have words of issuance that say, for the reasons discussed above, we adopt the interim rule as final. If they make changes, so it's not a wholesale replacement of the interim, but they're using the interim as a base. So they are adopting the interim as final with changes. And then they simply set out the changes that are necessary to update the CFR. And that does have an effective date, because that effective date is when we put those new changes in. So it's not that if we're talking about a final rule, I would say we should say something about adoption rather than final, because adoption is the language that agencies use in the document that is published in the Federal Register to describe what they're doing. If they issue a new rule that completely overwrites the interim because it's just wrong or it's not needed or there's something else, then they just issue a final rule. Or they go through notice and comment rulemaking separately. But this is we're talking about an adoption of a final rule. I mean, adoption of an interim rule to make it final. And it's a rule document, but it does not necessarily have any red text if they are adopting it without changes. So, I mean, I agree that if we put it in 9, well, I don't know. I think it would be okay in 9. Should issue subsequent final rule within a reasonable time. because I'd like to encourage agencies, not all agencies adopt their interim final rules. If they're not making any changes, they don't actually publish the follow-up document that says this is now final. And so those rules are then still interim if anybody goes and does the research in the Federal Register. They're not marked in any special way in the CFR. So you can't look at the CFR and say, oh, well, this is interim and this is final. Everything in the CFR is effective, or should be under the Federal Register Act. But if agencies are not making changes, they don't normally, I'll say, I don't know, somewhere between 40 and 60% of the time is when they adopt the final rule as final with no changes. So I think they should be encouraged to adopt it if it's going to be the final, no matter what. But I really don't like final. And they're not setting out the full rule text if they're adopting it as final without changes.
So if I take in terms of the changes to 8H, it would shift the language from will publish to will adopt. Is that the crux of the change? And then I guess we would have to have some language that suggests that this doesn't always happen. So as applicable or when appropriate. Or is that capturing what you're saying with respect to 8H?
Yeah, I mean, I think agencies as a matter of practice should always either adopt as final with changes, or get rid of it and do something else as appropriate.
Okay.
The problem is that they don't always adopt as final with no changes. They just leave it and say we're done, it's good enough. And it just stays as final. I mean, it just stays as interim for years until they decide to make other changes.
Got it. Thanks, Mary. Michael.
So Miriam's point, which I 100% agree with, is essentially my comment about paragraph 9. And I, if people are on board with that, I don't know that, well, anyway, so great. And I do think that's a very separate question than the exact wording of 8H, which may be superfluous in that it's intrinsic to the whole process, but B, it may just be sufficient to say that specifies that the agency will reconsider the interim rule in light of the comments received. But I don't know, maybe we just get rid of the whole thing.
Okay. So I'll put that on the board in terms of whether this is necessary. So I will take yours as a proposal to delete 8H, Michael. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay. So proposal to delete 8H. Ron.
So as I was saying before, and I think maybe Mark was as well, it's good to have it on the checklist, but it doesn't need to say a whole lot given what paragraph 9 says. So I think you probably just want to say that they will consider the comments and publish a rule as provided in paragraph 9. So it could be solely a cross-reference. It's still on the checklist, but it doesn't have intrinsic meaning except to refer us to where we're going in 9.
Okay, so specifies that the agency will consider comments and publish a final rule.
As provided in 9.
As provided in 9. Okay.
And therefore, you don't have to tell us what it is here because you're going to tell them momentarily.
Okay. So, a member of the committee want to sponsor that language. I'm assuming I could sponsor that language. I think that does.
I'm happy to as well. This is Amy.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Amy. So put that as a proposal instead of deleting it, putting forth the language that Ron has suggested that Amy and I both endorse.
I guess my idea is without prejudice to come up with some fancy word like final or replacement rule or a new final rule or something,
Right.
as the committee may prefer.
Got it. So we'll have to kind of, okay. Any objections to this change in language revision to 8H? There's already been a lot of commentary on 9. So I may ask you to kind of repeat some of those comments on 9 so that we could capture it in modified language, but let's start with 9. Michael.
I'm sorry, Burchell. I had one other little thing about 8.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So we haven't talked about sunset provisions at all. They pop up later in the recommendation. It seems to me if a rule has a sunset provision, it should be explicitly flagged when at the time the interim final rule is published. Now, maybe this just takes care of itself and doesn't have to be added to this list because it would be in the text of the actual rule and everyone would notice it. But maybe we want to add, one more provision here.
Okay.
It just says, identifies the sunset date if there is one. I mean, we could work on the
Sure.
staff could do the wording, but
Yeah, sure.
include that in this. That's sufficiently important to be flagged here on the checklist.
Okay, great. Sunset date. And so I'm gonna just walk through, just ask the questions to the people that have their hands up. Is it related to 8I, Alex? Your comment? Or you may potentially?
Yeah, I put my hand up for 9, so I'll
Okay, so
wait.
keep your hand up. Keep your hand up. I just want to make sure we have, if there's any comments on 8I. Mark, is yours on 8I?
No, it's on 9.
Okay, Andrew, 8I or 9?
I think more 8I, but only the only concern that this sounds like the interim final rule isn't a final rule, because the interim final rule is a final rule under the APA. I've always seen that any sort of final rule or final rule disposition of comments is sort of, is best practice. It sort of closes a loop within sort of the government system. It lets the world know that that project's over. But at least under the Administrative Procedure Act, the IFR was a final rule and it was fait accompli. The project, the thing was complete. So I think some of this just makes me a little nervous that it can get confusing as to, making me the impression that it isn't a final rule. The one
Right.
caveat there is where you do have some agencies where Congress has told them that if you call it an IFR, it automatically sunsets, and that's a different scenario.
Right. So I think we forgot to capture that point. We didn't properly address it. So this is back in 8H, and your suggestion is to kind of put the language final rule back into 8H. Is that, Andrew, is that what you're getting at here?
Yeah, or even if it's just a suggestion that, that sort of say that publish, I don't know how to describe it, but sort of a document that lets the public know the the rulemaking's over. And then sort of have parenthetic and say you can call this a final rule or a final rule disposition of comments or something like that.
Right.
It's sort of just closing the loop, just it's sort of helping the public know that this is over. Under the APA, it was already over when the IFR was published.
Okay. So why don't I'm going to sort of put that comment for the staff to figure out on the final rule in 8H to use language that will, specify its distinctiveness in the sense of either adding the language final rule or replacement rule as Ron has proposed in his scholarship, or something else entirely.
Bertrand, could I just suggest that maybe we say something like you would publish a notice that the interim final rule has become final, something like that. That would
okay.
It could just be a notice in the Federal Register. It doesn't have to be a new rule in there.
Well, it will be a notification and it will publish in the rules category, but the action line does not have to be rule.
Right.
But that doesn't cover if you change it. If it's not just
that would be captured under 9, right? So, I mean, we're still making it. It needs to be wordsmith, but I don't want to do that here. I just want to say that you can deal with that.
Right, so that's another possibility that Mark raises there. Okay, so let's just have us not get too bogged down in this point. We've heard the spirit of what you all are saying, and we will make those changes as appropriate.
Yeah, I would take issue with that, however.
Okay.
I don't want to notice. I want them to respond substantively to whatever comments they receive, whether they are standing by the rule or they're changing it.
Okay.
As 9 provides, a notice would not do that. I don't think you want one that says we are, you know, if a sunset provision applies, that's something different. But if there is a sunset, you know, well, if you decide after reading the comments you don't want to change it, that the new final rule becomes the notice. But you shouldn't just say, oh well, it stands. Never mind those of you who wrote the comments. We appreciate your writing. That's not part of the.
I defer to Ron on this. I think he's right. I thought that the notice could cover the response to comments, but I think it's a fair point.
Okay, so we'll again we'll deal with 8H. 8I, are there I guess since we have hands up, is there anybody that wants to just say something right now if you have a comment on 8I? If not, I will proceed to 9 with those hands that are up.
Yeah, I have a comment on 8I.
Okay, thanks, Samir.
I don't know that is really necessary. If an agency is going to have a sunset date, it's either in dates as an expiration date, at which point it's in dates and the text will disappear on that date, because that is an instruction of the Federal Register to remove it from the CFR. The agency can also put it in the regulatory text, in which case it's there. The text will remain in the CFR, but there is a statement that says this expired last year. And then we will, at some point, not necessarily soon, but at some point, get around to telling the agencies to remove the text if it's gone, if all they do is put it in the reg text. But if there's a sunset date, it will be in one of those two places, or it will be in both places. Because that's how sunset dates work, unless they're dealing with Congress that says something automatically, and they don't even talk about it in the document. But if they're going to have a sunset date and talk about a sunset date, they have to identify it.
Got it.
I don't know that I is necessary, at least here.
Got it. Michael, since you proposed I, do you have a response to Miriam?
When I proposed it, I said, I don't know if this is necessary.
Yeah, okay. Fair.
But it seems to me a critical enough issue as to merit flagging in the preamble. Even if there's, the preamble flags various things, and a lot of stuff is not strictly speaking necessary, but is useful to anybody trying to understand what the rule is and what it's doing. And this is an important enough one to flag. But that's all.
Okay.
I agree. It's a total judgment call. And if the committee thinks it's unnecessary, that's totally fine.
Okay. So are there any objections to removing I with the thought that we would reference this issue in the preamble somewhere?
I understood Michael to say that identifying the IFRS sunset date, if applicable, that would be in the preamble, not our preamble, but in the preamble to the rule, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I object to taking out I take Miriam's point that probably it's already required by Federal Register requirements, but just because it's required there, it may not be necessary, but I think it's a good idea to identify it. And so I think we should keep it in.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Any objections? So Miriam, are you still set with your objection with respect to keeping I?
I don't feel strongly enough one way or the other it's fine I don't think it's necessary. But if others want to put it in to reinforce that, I don't have an objection.
Any objections to keeping I? Just speak out because we have hands relevant to 9, so I won't be able to catch that you're talking about 8I. Any objections?
Oh, I have something on 8I. I don't know if others have.
Yeah, if it's about 8I, yes, please go ahead, Ron.
Let me read you verbatim from 95.4. Among the things that should be in the original notice, the agency should consider whether to include in the Federal Register notice a commitment to act on any significant adverse comments within a fixed period of time, or to provide for a sunset date for the rule. That speaks to Michael's point, and maybe if I were on the committee, what I would move is that we accept that in concept, but leave it to the staff to grammatically insert it.
Okay. So any other comments or objections, particularly objections to keeping I? Okay, so let's move to 9, then we'll keep I. We'll reword it, of course, but we'll keep I in the spirit of I. Okay, so Alex, I had you first on the queue before I cut you off to talk about 8I. So I'll call you on you first with respect to recommendation 9.
Thanks.
Can we scroll 9?
Yeah.
So for recommendation 9, particularly in light of 9B and 9C, it was unclear to OMB why 9A should effectively limit the application to significant regulatory actions under 12866. We would suggest that perhaps the reference to significant regulatory actions under 12866 should be, if anything, a prioritization mechanism for agencies, but it shouldn't limit agencies' obligation to respond to significant comments and modify the rule as appropriate. So I guess my suggestion would be to strike 9A and, if necessary, maybe include a reference to significance under 12866 after the consistent with agency resources and priorities.
Okay, so it consists with agency resources and priorities, and then there would be a reference there to
prioritizing. So
yeah, prioritizing.
We could perhaps say, yeah, prioritizing
okay
significant regulatory actions under Executive Order 12866. I don't feel strongly about the specific wording, so staff could probably work on that a little bit.
Sure. Okay, we got the spirit of it. Okay, and then Mark.
Yes, so I want to raise an issue that I think is likely to cause some discussion, but I think it's important. Michael Hurst, I think, just left, but he had pointed out in some written comments that the provision on reasonable time is inconsistent with the recommendation at number 12, which concerns the presidential executive order and the idea that there'd be a 1-year limit with an extension as an option that could be issued by the OMB on this. And I know that Alex Goodenough has also spoken out against any fixed time limit on when an IFR needs to be finalized. But let me just suggest that in some interviews that we had in preparation for the report, we talked to some agency people who had just, I don't want to disparage the agency people. I know they're busy and they've got a lot of things going on, but they did essentially let the IFRs languish, because why not? The rule was final, it went into effect, they were able to implement the rule. But there's a fundamental problem here, which is if we care about public comment and we allow the public comments to just sit there for 3 years or more before responding to them, I don't know what the purpose of the public comment process is at that point. It's too late to really have an impact on the final rule. I personally prefer a fixed time. I think a year is plenty of time. Most of these IFRs don't get a lot of comments. It shouldn't be that hard to finalize an interim final rule. I think under that circumstance, there could be an option for an extension on the 1-year deadline. But if they can't do it within a year, it seems to me that the meaningfulness of public comments is really undermined. And so I'd like to see some kind of a more rigorous standard in here. I think that the DC Circuit in the Medtex case suggested that this needed to be done expeditiously. I don't know if that's enough in terms of guidance to the agency. I really think a fixed deadline would be better, but that would be at least better than talking about a reasonable time, which the agencies apparently view as something that they can just let languish for a long period of time. So I'd really like some stronger language in here. Okay.
So the idea is to change reasonable time to some fixed period of time, preferably 1 year. And if there's a member of the committee that wants to sponsor and propose that particular fix going forward, we'll sort of note it in comment right now. Laura.
So I was thinking in light of some of the discussion on 8, I think H, and kind of where we've been headed, do we really need any of the, what was A, B, C, now is A, B? And can we just say that consistent with agency resources and priorities, an agency should issue a subsequent final rule within a reasonable time, responding to all significant comments and adopting, modifying, or rescinding the rule as appropriate, period.
Okay. So we'll be adding the language adopting, modifying, or rescinding the rule.
Yeah, just before I add that language, I mean, Laura, I understand what you'd be saying is, should we just have a recommendation that says, you know, full stop, agencies should finalize essentially all IFRs. That's the substance of your suggestion.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we have that proposal. We have a discussion or a question about the language reasonable time versus fixed time. Okay. Let me give Ben a chance to add that idea. Okay. Bill. And that would Laura, come back to you, Laura. I'm sorry. I'll come back to you, Bill, 1 second. And that would be deleting A and B under your proposal. Is that right, Laura?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Bill.
Well, I say I think that I sort of agree with Laura that would do the trick. It's a general thing. I like the idea of adding adopting as well as modifying or rescinding. And so I would move those if that's necessary. But I think Laura's a member of the committee as well. Turning to Mark's suggestion for a time, I'm happy. I like his idea. I think 18 months would be a sort of compromised limit of time. I would recommend 18 months, and we could even realizing it says consistent with agency resources and priorities, right? So that even gives them an out. And this would be in lieu of having an executive order, right? This is my trade-off, all right? I think there's other problems with having an executive order. Not that there's a power problem with the authority to ask the president to do that, but I just think there's other problems, and that would be binding, right? Here, it's not binding. It's a strong recommendation. It's something to hold up, and I'm willing to go with that. If that's, you know, that's my suggestion, is put it 18 months, within 18 months, instead of reasonable time.
Okay. So we have a fixed time suggested here. Mark, do you consider that a friendly amendment, or do you?
I do. I think it's still worth having a discussion about an executive order. I mean,
sure.
I'd like to see some stronger sort of assurance that this kind of thing is going to happen and it's not just advisory. But I take Bill's point, and I do consider his idea of 18 months being a compromise.
Okay. So we have a couple proposals on the table. I haven't heard any objections to the language. I forgot now. Alex's language with respect to prioritizing significant regulatory actions under 1286 and moving that and deleting A. So please object if you have those objections, but I'm assuming that we're accepting that. A question that we're still wrestling with is the reasonable time versus a fixed period of time, 18 months being the proposal on the table for that. And then we also have the proposal set forth by Laura with respect to adding the language, adopting, modifying, or rescinding the rule as appropriate, and deleting A and B. Alex.
So I was going to, maybe I'll start with the deletion of A and B. I think I wouldn't object to that. So I think that seems reasonable, particularly in light of the edits to recommendation 8 above. Okay. On reasonable time, I know that we're trying to be efficient here, so I won't reiterate all of OMB's comments that were provided in writing. I'll just note that OMB thinks that a 1-year period is far too short and thinks that a 3-year period is more reasonable, but nonetheless believes that agencies are best placed to be able to make judgments. And I know that we're retaining the agency consistent with agency resources and priorities, so that's acknowledged here, but we still think that a fixed time period is not helpful, since agencies can make priority decisions within them based on their resources and other events. So just leave it at that.
Okay. And so that's kind of push back on the fixed period of 18 months to maintain the language reasonable time here. Mark.
Can I just suggest a slight modification from the 18-month idea? Sure. I would maybe say as expeditiously as practicable, but in no more than 18 months after the IFR is published, or something to that effect.
Okay. So as expeditiously as practicable, but no more than.
I take that as a friendly amendment to my suggestion.
Okay. Okay. And Alex, I assume that you're still you still prefer the reasonable time language.
Yes, I would prefer reasonable time, maybe in the interest of trying to negotiate a solution here. Perhaps talking about it 18 months as a best practice, or some fixed time period as a best practice, could be a way of softening this further. Okay. But yeah, I'll stick with my previous comments, basically opposing a fixed time period.
Okay. So some language, and we won't wordsmith here, but the spirit of it as best practices. Mark, is that satisfying, or do you still prefer the language that you proposed?
I think I still prefer the other language, but I mean, as it is, we know that this would be advisory anyway, so I'm not sure that we need to make it even softer.
Okay. Any other comments on reasonable time and the different alternative proposals that have been put forth? Ron, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so to deal with the various calls here, I agree with Laura's position on deleting the conditions A, B, and C. This is consistent with my earlier comment that really the agency has promised to take action, and so you don't need the qualifiers. You're already saying agency resources and priorities, and as appropriate, that's all the qualifier you need. So I would eliminate everything beginning with if.
Okay.
I guess there seems to be something approaching a consensus on that, but I would agree. As I agree in substance with adopting, except I think reaffirming would be better, because it's already on the books, and so adopting may be a little inapt.
Okay.
But the idea is right. With regard to the reasonable time versus something stricter, I'm not sure when the right time to bring this up is, because we've got a provision that would deal with it more directly at the end of the recommendation. When we get at the appropriate time, I'm going to argue for not doing anything at all with regard to that and rejecting Mark's position outright. But whether we do that now or when we get to the later paragraphs, is debatable, but if we're already doing it now, I'll give you my position on that.
Let's wait till the later paragraph so we don't get
All right,
too.
so what I would say is this: if we're going to strike that paragraph, as I will urge, I assume Mark would be okay with a reasonable time here as a fallback. But we could just put that on hold until we get to the later one and
Sure.
revisit that line
Okay.
in light of what we do there.
Sure, that sounds good. That makes sense. So why don't we delete A and B? Laura, in terms of language adopting versus reaffirming, do you consider that to be a friendly amendment, or do you prefer the language adopting?
I don't have strong feelings. I was using adopting because Miriam said that that was the FR language.
Okay. So we'll use reaffirming or adopting there. We'll kind of figure out with the staff to kind of what the appropriate language would be there. And then we'll return to the reasonable time question when we get to the later paragraphs, if that's okay, since we haven't fully resolved it yet.
Just a point of clarification. So I understand we're not going to wordsmith this parenthetical language here, but I mean, one approach for this recommendation could be to say that agencies should finalize significant regulatory actions under 12866, and then kind of all that language applies. Or it's that, and this is kind of more what I understood Laura to be saying, which is that agencies should agencies should finalize all IFRs, and then we have this kind of, but they should kind of prioritize significant regulatory action. So, I mean, does that distinction make sense? Are we saying that this recommendation applies to all rules and the agencies should consider prioritizing those significant actions? Or are we saying that this recommendation only applies in the case of significant regulatory actions?
I thought it was all rules and prioritizing significant regulatory actions is how I understood it. Alex, but your comments are specific to this. So yeah, what do you have to say?
Yeah, so I won't speak for Laura, but my proposal was to have this paragraph 9 apply more broadly than significant regulatory actions, and that significant regulatory actions would only be a prioritization mechanism.
Yes.
And to be honest, I don't feel that strongly about that. If there's other prioritization language in there, it's just, since 12866 was in there and I'm OMB, I'm going to keep it in there. But yeah, I think paragraph 9 should apply more broadly than just significant actions.
Laura, is that consistent with your idea as well?
That is.
Okay. Is that enough for you, Ben?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move to recommendation number 10. Bill.
I'm trying to find where exactly it is. It should be line 163, I think. It says before issuing a director interim final rule. And I think it should say before invoking a good cause exception.
Okay, before invoking a good cause exception. Okay. Got it. Okay. Ron.
On 171 to 72, it says that the agency should explain how input received through such engagement informed or influenced development of the rule. It could be pretty hard to tell if you're getting some comments that are in the comment process and you got other comments through the informal consultation, and now you have to reconstruct to what extent or whether it came from the one or the other. That could be difficult.
Right.
So what are you suggesting, Ron? Deleting it?
I'm just complaining.
Yeah.
I don't have a language there, but I think that might see if there is sentiment that is maybe asking them to do too much.
So I think that if it is difficult, it may be to delete after everything after and how on line 171, or including and how.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe.
Okay.
And
Alex?
nothing would prevent them from spelling that out if they want to, but I think maybe making it prescriptive goes too far.
Okay. Okay. Alex.
So I also submitted written comments on this topic, so I won't I won't read them out here, but this seems impractical in many circumstances, so perhaps the addition of when appropriate takes care of that. Particularly, it seems like the suggestion to do advance notices of proposed rulemakings, listening sessions, all of this sounds like things that if an agency is correctly invoking the good cause exception, either should be, unnecessary, impractical, contrary to public interest. I think I'm sympathetic to the idea that some public engagement can help to inform the invocation of the good cause exception, but a lot of this just seems to be largely inapplicable in the circumstances that we're discussing. So in terms of concrete edit, I guess I would suggest striking I think potentially the second sentence, is it? Starting supplemental forms.
Yeah. Okay. And so just like leave it at those that are identified in 2018-7, rather than spelling out particular supplemental forms of supplemental engagement here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we have one proposal on the table, one sort of half proposal on the table, or two real proposals, one half proposal on the table. Any objections to either of the three, whether it be changing or incorporating the language invoking the good cause exception and line 163 and deleting issuing or a direct or final rule, and then the second one is Alex's suggestion to delete the second sentence, starts at 166 through 169. And the third one, which is still ambiguous as to whether it is a proposal, deleting the language that's highlighted here on 171, 172. So I will just to expedite things, I will propose that we delete the language on 171 and 172, and then if we get objections, we can always re-add it. So just to have that proposal on the table. Okay. So any objections to these changes? Or any of these changes?
Up on line 163, you delete issuing a direct or interim final rule.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah, this was going to be my question. So what are we just deleting only issuing a direct or interim final rule? Because then the sentence, before invoking the good cause exemption when such engagement, yeah, I have to work with it, but you want to retain this, the rest of this language, right?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll just work with it from a style perspective.
Okay. Okay, if there are no objections to this change, we'll move forward to recommendation number 11. These changes, excuse me. We'll move forward to recommendation number 11. Laura, is this about 10 or 11?
Actually, I apologize. Can we roll back up to 9 real quick?
Oh, sure. Okay, 9.
When we're talking about prioritizing significant regulatory actions, are we just talking about economically significant regulatory actions or any rule designated as significant?
I thought any rule designated significant, but Ben, is that right? Wrong?
That's the way we drafted it. It would apply to all significant regulatory actions.
Yeah.
Okay. I was asking because almost all of our rules are considered significant, so that kind of doesn't really draw any distinction.
Got it. But I assume it would draw distinctions for other agencies potentially.
I'm going to defer to Alex on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think
Sure.
for many agencies that would be a meaningful prioritization mechanism. I don't know that I feel particularly strong. I would suggest retaining the reference just to significant regulatory actions as opposed to lifting the bar higher in terms of prioritization to those that are significant under 3F1. And I think for many agencies, that there would be a lot of actions that aren't significant at all, more that are significant, and then relatively smaller percentage that are 3F1 significant. So I think this is kind of a medium choice in terms of prioritization.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we'll move back down to 11. I think your hand originally was up for 11, Alex, is that right? Oh, no. Okay. So we'll read through 11 and see if there are any comments on that. 11. Yes, Jeff.
I don't think we need to be so specific in A through D in 11. I suggest saying that our recommendation 2014-4 on ex parte communications and informal rulemaking should apply to both IFR rulemaking and DFR rulemaking.
Okay.
And I also noted that 2014-4 says that agencies should not impose restrictions on ex parte communications before an NPRM is issued, although they may disclose them if they want to. And the way this recommendation is written, it would apply to pre-NPRM communications, but it doesn't really differentiate between them and others.
Okay. So maybe kind of making the reference at 2014-4 here.
Right.
Okay.
And also, I had one other comment about this, which was when we're talking about subsequent rule, the subsequent final rule on line 178, that, and we've already gone over this with respect to IFR,
Right.
but for DFR, it doesn't really fit so well because any subsequent rule would be a regular notice and comment rule that would be separate from the original DFR, from the DFR. And also, I don't think an agency would ever do much public engagement during the comment period of the DFR because, I mean, they might want to do some beforehand, but once they issue it as a DFR, they would simply wait to see if anybody objected.
So with that suggestion here, I mean, I'm trying to kind of figure out in terms of modification, would
Yeah.
we just eliminate reference to DFR in this recommendation and just have it focus on IFRs?
Possibly. I mean, not with respect to the ex parte stuff, but
Sure. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
maybe there needs to be two separate recommendations here. One
Yeah.
on ex parte, or just have a paragraph on ex parte that references 2014-4, and but I haven't thought through how to
Yeah, sure.
redraft it.
Okay. I mean, it could be all of 11 until you get to 180 is referencing interim final rules. And then from 180 to 181, which would be modified to just make reference to recommendation 2014-4 would apply to both direct final rules and interim final rules. Okay. So that's one possibility. So we'll try to sort of work with that, get more comments, and try to figure out what modifications we can make.
The citation's in the link now.
Okay,
in the chat.
Great, thank you. Alex.
So again, consistent with my written comments, I was going to suggest the addition of reference to retrospective review in paragraph 11. Obviously, this is going to be caught up in the issue of whether or not we're going to have a firm expiration date for IFRs, but perhaps as an alternative to that, my suggestion would be that we include a statement that agencies should prioritize IFRs, maybe that are significant rules under 12866 for retrospective review consistent with ACUS recommendation 2021-2 and EO 13563. I think this would, if it belongs in 11, I would suggest putting it perhaps in 170, line 176, and after the sentence that ends substance of the rule.
Okay. Okay. So we'll add that into there. Okay. Okay. So we have added language there. We're still trying to figure out whether, yeah. Okay. And that would be applicable. Let me see. Okay, so that would be particularly applicable to interim final rule. So it also is another point in favor of, at least in the first part of recommendation 11, eliminating the reference to direct final rules and having the recommendation with respect to direct final rules be in interim final rules combined be about the ex parte communication point, which is referenced in 2014-4. Annalise.
Yeah, I just had a question, which is what outcome is the recommendation seeking to achieve by by recommending public input on whether or not good cause was properly invoked for IFRs? Because in those instances, the rule will already be in place. For a DFR, I understand that you know that might encourage an agency to issue an NPRM, but for an IFR, is that for just for understanding for future rulemakings? I'm just trying to understand that.
Right. Right. Okay. It's a good question. I don't know if folks have a particular response to Annalise. I'll call on Bill. I know your hand was raised before Annalise made our comment by something that we should think about.
Actually, I was going to comment on A as well, which was to say, I think it should just be deleted because, as Jeff Lubbers mentioned, if it's a direct final rule, you wait and hear your comments. You're not going to go out and affirmatively ask people things. I just don't see using supplemental forms of engagement for a DFR. And as Annalise says, I don't see whether it really makes much sense when you have an interim final rule. So I think it just should be deleted.
Okay. Okay. So the proposal is to delete A. Is that consistent with your thoughts as well, Annalise?
That works for me.
Okay. Ron.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff's basic position. I grudgingly went along with public engagement and when you're deciding whether to issue a direct final rule. But if you've decided to do it, then by definition, you don't expect any, you expect it to be non-controversial. So I think probably you don't want to encourage going out to find more.
So that means deleting reference to direct final rule here.
At least, but I think Bill wanted to go further and I haven't really thought through his argument.
Right. Okay. That's proposal. And do we still think that direct final rule should be relevant to the recommendations with respect to ex parte communications?
Well, if you're not seeking it, then I guess you wouldn't set up all that procedure to structure it. I suppose if someone proactively reached out to talk to you, you would want some of that stuff, but I don't know if you need to just get into that. I mean, 2014-4 exists anyway, but it may be getting too esoteric to explore that.
Okay. Okay, so I propose deleting, consistent with Bill and Ron, the reference to direct final rule there. And we have the deletion of A. We have the language added by Alex that's in red. And then we kind of go through to line 182. And then we have the discussion of ex parte communication. That starts with 182 through 187. Okay, so the challenge here is we have the first part that's referring only to interim final rulemaking. To the extent that we even reference 2014-4 with respect to ex parte communication, we think it should be relevant potentially to direct final rulemaking and interim final rulemaking. So I think that that's the spirit of a change that we would need to make, and we don't need to wordsmith it now. And that would be the reference 2014-4 would requires that we delete A and B and just have that reference to 2014-4 instead. We still have C and D. I don't think that that's covered in 2014-4. Bill? You're deleted, Bill. Or you're muted. You're muted, Bill.
I'm deleted too.
I don't even know.
I'm up at lines 178 through 183 or 182. It shouldn't say if an agency publishes a subsequent final rule that supersedes the previous one. We're only talking about interim final rules here. So if an agency publishes, why wouldn't this just be whenever an agency should use supplemental forms of public engagement after the issuance of an interim final rule, period.
Okay.
I mean, you're asking for comments on the interim final rule. So the answer is not only formal comments, but supplemental stuff. So I could see this thing just saying an agency should use supplemental forms of public engagement after issuing an interim final rule, period.
Okay. So after issuing an interim final rule, and you don't think that reference to when such engagement would help the agency obtain input on the substance of the rule is necessary here?
No, I guess I'd say after I put an agency should consider using supplemental forms of public engagement after issuing an interim final rule, period.
Full stop. Okay. So agencies should consider using
An agency
or
agencies should consider
should
consider using. Then go to skip to supplemental forms. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And then period after issuing, no, leave after issuing an interim final rule, period, prior to when such engagement.
Okay, so right.
Period.
Okay.
And then it could down to 180. The sentence could start at 180. It should explain in any subsequent final rule, whatever we're going to use that phrase for, what supplement undertook and how the subject. In other words, you wouldn't have to have the whole thing. Just it should explain in the subsequent final.
So
in any subsequent final rule.
Yeah. Okay. And so you just kind of go to. You already have the language here, Ben.
In any subsequent final rule. Strike down to it. Go back to it should be a final rule. Yeah, that's it. Right. What supplemental? The subsequent final rule. Yeah, keep going. Stop.
Yeah,
there you go.
What supplemental public engagement agency and stuff. So this is also the language. We also have the language that we took out before of how the input received through such engagement informed or influenced development of that rule. I think you would agree, Ron, that we should delete that language here as well.
Which, I'm sorry.
The language that starts on 182 and how the input received through such engagement informed or influenced development of that rule, the language that we deleted.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's delete that language. And then maybe we start new recommendation 12 here after undertook. And then the question is, do we, I mean, I'm kind of hearing mixed voices on this, whether we should even have, I think we agree that we shouldn't have reference to ex parte communication here. At most, we should have 2014-4 referenced. Do we agree that that's all we need to do, or do we even need 2014-4 at all? Is the question that I'm going to raise here. And we don't have to wordsmith it, but if we agree that just reference to 2014-4 is all we need with respect to A and B, we'll just do that. Any objections to that move?
I don't have objection to that move. I think to respond to one of the things that Jeff said, we ought to say that for purposes of that ACUS recommendation, the issuance of the interim final rule should be considered as a notice of public rulemaking. Because Jeff said that the recommendation does not apply to it only applies after an NOPR or NPRM. And we want to treat the interim final rule adoption as like a notice of proposed rulemaking.
Okay. Could you repeat that language? We'll kind of play with it, but just make sure we capture what you're saying as in the spirit, Bill.
Whatever the language is going to be to refer people to the ACUS recommendation should be a sentence that says, for purposes of applying the terms of that recommendation,
okay,
the issuance of the interim final rule should be considered a notice of proposed rulemaking.
Okay.
Sorry, Bill, did you say the issuance of?
Yeah, whatever the language, you can
Yeah,
play.
so yeah, the issuance of the IFR should be
considered
a
the
notice of-
equivalent of.
The
Okay.
equivalent of.
Yeah, we can work with that. Something like that.
Okay. Any comments on that proposal or objections to that language, that new language, or anything else with respect to 12, new 12? Okay.
And so just to clarify, yeah, so we're going to be deleting all of this and just having it's basically just a reference to the ex parte recommendation, and then treating the IFR as equivalent to an NPRM.
That's correct. Okay. That's how I understand it. Is that correct for everyone else? Okay. All right. Any other comments on 12? All right, so let's move forward to recommendation number 13, and I'll let Ben write what he's writing first before moving down. Okay, 13, Ron.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak to the substance of it, and maybe we can avoid a discussion about whether and when we address the president, because I don't think we should adopt the substance here, even as an ACUS recommendation. That'll, so the question of whether you ask the president to do it would not have to be reached. This seems to me pretty major surgery on the good cause exemption. They're important issues here, and I really question whether this should be done as an afterthought to a recommendation on public engagement with the rulemaking process, where we have one meeting to discuss it, and which raises a number of really important issues, which are not squarely within the scope of the charge, if they are within it at all. and which are not based, in my judgment, on a sufficient record of abuses. I read the report, and the reason that Mark gives for wanting to deal with impose new curbs is that he relies on an article by a GW Law student paper published in the GW Law Review. And yes, he had very fine advisors in a star footnote: Dick Pierce, Emily Hammond, Kristen Hickman, outstanding scholars, but still, it's a student paper. And what it does is to say there are a lot more invocations of the good cause exemption than there were. They are increasing. There could be a number of reasons why they increase, like regulatory legislation that calls for them. But regardless, the paper doesn't go into the question of how many of those, which of those, were claims of good cause that were unjustified. There are more of them, but does it show that 80% were wrongheaded, that 20% were, that even one was? No, it doesn't say that any of them was. There are no cases in which courts said, "Whoa, you're really misusing the good cause exemption." He's simply making an inference from the fact that there are a lot more of them to saying, well, it probably, a lot of those are wrongheaded, and so some significant changes should be made. I don't think that's a sufficient empirical basis for ACUS to act. If you're going to act at all, you should do a study of those, which is not part of a public engagement study, but one that looks at the increase of good cause invocations and considers seriously, in terms of their facts, whether the process really is out of control. I think that is the sort of thing that the conference should do, rather than adopt it in this sort of very oblique fashion. And there are significant policy issues here, especially with regard to the time limits that we were talking about earlier. About a decade ago, the ABA Administrative Law Section was responding to a bill that would have imposed time limits on rulemaking, not just major rules. 270 days for most rules, 18 months for major rules. So it would have been more lenient. And the ad law section said, you know, a lot of us are bothered too that agencies let these rules languish, they don't finish them, and that's really troublesome. But the comment went on to say, we don't think this kind of hard deadline is the right way to respond. We relied there on what 95-4 said, the ACUS recommendation, which didn't require a uniform government-wide deadline, said you should make individual choices where the agency should, if it so desires. It's actually the language I quoted earlier, but it was not endorsing the broad across the board rule, and the report accompanying it indicated that was a conscious choice. And it said there are some real downsides to such a deadline, because if the agency can't meet the deadline, it has the unpalatable choice of allowing its rule to lapse or rushing the process through to completion before the public comments have been properly analyzed and modifications carefully considered. Neither of those is desirable. An agency may be unable to meet the deadline for many legitimate reasons. Often, a large set of complex interim rules are adopted at the same time to implement a new statute. They would all expire at the same time, creating a serious time crunch. Or the agency may confront more urgent rulemaking or enforcement priorities, so staff is simply not available. Or the leadership of the agency may change just before the rule expires, and they want to put their own stamp on it. These are significant issues. I'm not asking, I don't think the committee should try to resolve the merits of that. But what I do say is there are good arguments on both sides, and it deserves a study by ACUS in its own right. I don't think the committee has a sufficient factual basis here to opine on these things, and really shouldn't be doing it in the context of a public participation recommendation. So I would just think these recommendations should not be followed, with the possible exception of the one at the end that says the executive order should recommend what we're recommending, which I think would not be really needed. So I would urge the committee to just drop this paragraph.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Mark.
Yes, so I didn't expect this to just fly through the committee, so I'm not surprised by Ron's comments, and I certainly think that he makes some very good points about sort of making recommendations that would ask for an executive order from the president. Let me just say that I approach this mostly from the perspective of, are we promoting meaningful engagement with the public? And I think that the record on IFRs in particular suggests that we're not. Ron was pointing out to some legislation that Congress was considering on deadlines for rules. I mean, this is different, of course. The rule goes into effect, and then the agencies, and again, I'm not trying to disparage agency people. I know they work hard. I know they have a lot of competing concerns, but agencies just let these IFRs languish. And why not? Because the rule's in effect and they don't really need to do anything. And I guess my sense is there ought to be somehow more urgency about finalizing the rule, and most importantly, responding to public comments that are received on the IFR. And Ron's right, in 95-4, there was a recommendation that agencies should set a fixed amount of time and maybe set a drop dead date on the rule, a sunset provision on the rule. I don't think agencies do that, though. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to hear that. But my sense is that agencies aren't following that recommendation. I fear if we simply say agencies should provide a reasonable time to respond, that nothing will change, as it really hasn't changed since we opined in 95-4. So I just think that maybe it's worth having this discussed by the broader committee, the ACUS group in Washington, just because I think it's an important issue. And I don't, again, I'm not suggesting that maybe we keep this in. I understand that there are good reasons maybe for not making this kind of recommendation, but how do we encourage agencies to do better than they've been doing, even with prior recommendations that are similar? I don't know what the answer is. I'd surely like to see a fixed period of time. I take Ron's point that maybe a year, maybe 18 months is even not enough time, although I'm a little skeptical because it seems like most of the IFRs don't get that many comments. But again, you could put a provision in that allowed OMB to extend the comment period in extenuating circumstances. I just think somehow we need to make clear that there is an urgency to finalize these rules or issue some kind of final rule so that the public feels like they were heard when they're commenting. And I don't think that's happening right now. And I guess my sense is if you're going to take 3 years or more to respond to public comments on an IFR, you might as well just forget the whole idea of an IFR, because that, to my mind, is not a meaningful public comment process. So I'd love to hear sort of more discussion of this issue. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I do think it's important. I had suggested as an alternative that maybe OMB would issue the guidance, which wouldn't, of course, be binding in the same way as an executive order. But
I wouldn't put that on the calendar, though. Well, yeah.
Sounds like somebody might be off mute when they don't realize.
Yeah.
Well,
can you mute them from
like
that side,
committee
Ben?
meeting wasn't on the calendar.
I'll stop so we can maybe get.
Yeah.
Well, I would come in earlier.
You have the capacity to mute.
Yeah, let me just see if I can play. Somebody's probably.
There you go. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Annalise, thank you, Mark, for your comments. You were finished with your comments? Yes. Okay. Annalise.
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts. One is recognizing, of course, that no one wants these IFRS language. I don't think obviously any agencies issue them expecting them to last for as long as they do. Other circumstances lead to them going for a long time. But I think that in the event that something like this became an executive order, I do wonder if there would be unintended consequences, rather than running afoul of said executive order, if agencies would choose to just issue final rules without notice and comment, and not seek public engagement in other forms, because rather than issue an IFR and have a time limit, and potentially running afoul of that, if they don't meet it, under the APA, they can just issue a final rule without notice and comment. And I think that some agencies might choose to do that in the event that they see the IFR potentially, there's an administration change, or they anticipate that they might receive a lot of comments, or for whatever circumstance. And then the other just like thing that I would add is, one of the concerns obviously is the length of time, but the other concern is responding to public comments. And so another way to address that could potentially be a recommendation that if, a certain period of time has lapsed since the IFR was published, that the agencies could be encouraged to go out for comment again. Or if, something has changed that might necessitate public comment. So those were my thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Annalise. Bill.
Well, I'm always reluctant to disagree with Ron Levin, but I think the analogy to the APA's position on the proposed legislation is just wrong, because one, it was talking about all rules, and rules are no, okay.
No, just interim.
In terms of the fact that it would have a legal effect, all right, the legal effect that would essentially make it the rule lapse, and we're not talking about that. And my suggestion had been to delete 13, and for that matter 14 if we get to it, but 13 altogether as an executive order, because that would have certain sort of real legal effects on the agency. And I didn't want that. I wanted to say, and I thought Alex's idea of saying 18 months was sort of a best practices type of thing, right? That we should put back into what used to be number 9, that they should issue a subsequent final rule within a reasonable time. And we'd be suggesting what we think a reasonable time is, 18 months. Of course, it's consistent with agency resources and priorities. So it's a soft 18 months, but it's sort of something there. And I think there was a basis in Mark's report for saying this is being abused, not all across the board for all agencies, but that it is abused, and that we should try to set up for a perhaps later study whether or not this 18 months is itself being abused, all right? But I think the idea of saying as a best practices, we think 18 months is enough time, is an appropriate thing to do, but I'd put it in number 9, where it wouldn't be legally binding in any sense. That doesn't go as far as Mark wants, but it certainly, I think, alleviates much of the concerns that Ron has.
Yeah. So the proposal that we have now is that we're deleting 13 entirely, and we're adding into 9 some reference to reasonable time being as best practices 18 months, something along those lines, modifying, of course, my inelegant language. Alex.
Yeah, so I think that would be consistent with what I said previously, and OMB's written comments on what used to be 12 was now 13. OMB doesn't think that a fixed expiration date for IFRs is appropriate or helpful. I know we're very short of time, so I won't go into much more depth, but I'll also note that we had concerns about 12B too. So I think deleting 12 and, as discussed, returning to 9 to discuss the best practice would be a good negotiated sort of compromise solution from OMB's perspective.
Okay. Are there any sort of objections, particularly objections from committee members to deleting recommendation 12? Okay. And I'll return to the language with respect to reasonable time shortly. Lon.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
I was trying not to raise this because I think it may be unique to tax regulations, but a lot of Ron's concerns and Mark's concerns actually occurred in the mid to late 1980s. And Congress addressed that by specific provision in the tax code, 7805E. Says if the code refers to them as temporary regulations, which is why several sessions ago I asked the difference between a temporary regulation and an IFR. But to me, they look like IFRs, despite the code's language. And it says that every temporary regulation has to be accompanied by a proposed regulation. So you're going to get your notice and comment, and it's a statutory requirement. But it also says that the temporary regulation, which I think is the interim regulation under our terminology, says shall expire within 3 years after the date of issuance. So the Congress figured that 3 years was a good time period. If we keep 12 in, I was going to recommend that at least something in the preamble, even a footnote, say that it doesn't apply to temporary regulations under Code Section 7805E. But if we take it out, we may not need that. But there's a history there that if ACUS does take up a project, there's a history there of how this worked, what the problems were with public comments, and what the congressional solution was, and over the last, I think it was 1988, since 1980, how that's worked. So there is some evidence that might be useful to ACUS.
Right. So I think that, Lon's point is kind of consistent with Ron's point and point made earlier about other issues, is that maybe this is something that's worthy of study, and something that can be, potentially the focal point of a future recommendation if we do decide to delete it here. So deletion does not mean it's forgotten, but the question for us is, do we want to keep it in this recommendation here? Are there any members of the committee or otherwise that want to raise a point about keeping this recommendation 12 here in this recommendation? Okay. Recommendation 13. Bill.
As I indicated, I think it should be deleted. I mean, it's just saying OMB should tell agencies to follow our recommendation. That doesn't seem to me. Agencies should follow our recommendations or not. Putting OMB to issue guidance, I don't know what guidance they would give, but I just think it's superfluous and unnecessary.
Okay. So proposals to delete recommendation 13. Any objections to deleting recommendation 13? Let's return to recommendation 9, if we can. And we'll wordsmith this later, but we might want to specify the proposal that's on the table that I'll make, that reasonable time, that there be some references to as best practice. We keep the language reasonable time, but have maybe a parenthetical or something after a comment that suggests as best practices 18 months is whatever reasonable time or whatever it might be, but some reference to a fixed time as a particular fixed time being 18 months as best practice is something that we are thinking about adding to 9. Are there any objections to that addition? Bill?
I suggest that we do put in that reasonable fixed time being 18 months as a best practice.
Okay.
And I think you could do it as a separate sentence at the end.
Got it. Right. Okay, so that's great. So maybe add that reference to the meaning of reasonable time, or as best practice, or best practice with respect to reasonable time. Mark.
Right.
Yeah, I'd really like to take out reasonable time, which just seems so vague and unhelpful, and gives agencies way too much, I think, discretion to let these things languish. But I agree with Bill that maybe something about best practices being 18 months. Again, I would suggest that agencies should do it expeditiously. Maybe some language like that, and I think the MedTech's decision supports that approach. So as expeditiously as practicable, but preferably within 18 months or something. Best practices are within 18 months, and I defer to the staff to wordsmith that idea.
Okay, so I'll propose expeditious as a replacement for reasonable, to see if there's any objections to that proposal. Alex.
No objections to expeditiously versus reasonable. I'll just go on to note that OMB thinks that a 3-year period is more appropriate. Rulemaking, unfortunately, does take a lot of time, and agencies have limited resources that they can devote to each rulemaking. While better than a year, 18 months is still very expeditious, to use that term again. So I would suggest a longer period of 3 years.
Okay. So there's a proposal that the best practice will be within 3 years. Mark, is that an old hand or a new hand? Okay. Old hand. Jeff.
We already say consistent with agency resources and priorities, so I don't think we should worry too much about a year and a half. I mean, or if we stated it as a best practice, we've already had that lead in. Can I make one other general comment?
Sure.
I think one of the main reasons this recommendation might be timely is because of the Little Sisters of the Poor case,
Right.
which is referenced in the preamble. We haven't talked about the preamble very much, but that was, a case where the court sort of didn't even really check to see whether the agency had good cause to begin with, and the agency was able to do what it wanted to do. I think I just want to make sure that the recommendation emphasizes that we really think these two things IFRs and DFRs should only be done where there is good cause, and I know we sort of say it in passing, but I wish we could be more firm on that.
Right. I mean, we do say, we'll come back to the preamble at our 6th meeting. And then I guess I would like you to hold that point, Jeff, to see if our reference to the preamble combined with what we say in the recommendation is sufficient to push that point that you're making.
Okay.
Ron.
I won't repeat what I've said. I don't think that you have a factual record on which to make a recommendation that really has moral authority. But to recognize Mark's general concern, which is certainly a valid one, I think what you should do instead of tinker with the language of this paragraph is put something in the preamble, say that the conference is concerned about the fact that many IFRs are never completed, and this would merit a subsequent study.
Okay.
On which recommendations could be pursued.
Okay.
And then you wouldn't have to tinker with the text where you really are just pulling it out of the air. For what it's worth, the ad law section said it should be no less than 3 years, but I wouldn't try to specify at this point what the timetable should be.
Okay. Not even as best practices, Ron.
No, I think you should do that on the basis of a study and consideration of the pros and cons.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. We're running short on time. So Bill and Lon, I don't think we'll be able to resolve whether to have a time, so we'll have to return to both 4D and 9 along with the preamble at our next meeting. We'll start with the preamble so we can at least get through that. Bill.
If we're going to have another meeting, then fine, I will comment.
Okay. Yeah, we will. I don't think we can complete this discussion. Lon.
I was just going to say that I completely agree with what Ron said.
Okay. Okay. So we'll return to 4D and 9 are kind of the pending items with respect to recommendation and the preamble. We'll have our next meeting on Tuesday, next Tuesday. We've got permission from Andy and the powers that be at ACUS to hold one final meeting. Has to be the final one because we're out of time, from 10 to 12 on Tuesday, in which we'll discuss those 3 items, 4D, 9, and the preamble. Okay. Thank you guys all for your input and your feedback and your attention to this recommendation. And I will look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.